Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar focusing on COVID-19 and Canadian and US immigration developments. Today we're joined by Managing Partner Stephen Green, US Practice Director Tim Golden, and Senior Associate Cristina Guida. If you have any questions, you can reach out to us at info@gans.com or by emailing the contact email addresses provided on screen. The panelists will also save some time at the end of the webinar to answer your questions, so please feel free to type out your questions in the text box on the right side of your computer, and we'll do our best to get to them. Don't forget to follow us on social media and sign up to our alerts where we provide the latest immigration updates and breaking news. And with that, I'll hand things over to our panelists.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope everyone is doing well. So from our last webinar, things seem to be, settling down in the sense of we're beginning to learn the various policies that the border group, I call them, are implementing. And when I call them a border group, I think it's important for everybody to understand who is evaluating whether or not a foreign national is permitted to come into Canada. And the group really begins with the airline. The airline has been given the authority by the Canadian government to determine whether or not you are permitted to come to Canada and board an aircraft if required. And it's at that point that individuals must demonstrate that they meet the exemptions that the Canadian government has provided for them to enter Canada. And we'll talk about some of those exemptions. And if you are permitted to enter on an aircraft from outside of Canada, then once you arrive at the border, you then meet our border service officer, who their responsibility is to also determine whether or not you meet the exemptions that the Canadian government has provided. And it's important to understand that it's really those two individuals that are maintaining and managing the policies of the immigration department. So what you have is you've got the immigration department deciding who is exempt from the ban of people coming into Canada. You have the aeronautics department looking at who should be quarantined. You have the public security creating a policy, but it really is the airlines and the border service officers that are managing the policies that are being created by these various departments. And again, it's important to understand that there is a ban of people coming to Canada with many exemptions for that. And one of them is the concept of a essential versus non-essential worker. And what happens here is that an individual is permitted to come into Canada if they have received a work permit prior to being in Canada, meaning that they were here before maybe and they went away for a holiday or they were out traveling. So they currently hold an actual work permit document, or they have been approved by a Canadian embassy, consulate, or high commission to pick up their work permit at the border. And it's there with those two documents that, again, the airline will determine whether or not you are permitted to get on the aircraft, and then you meet the border service officer. And I guess, Cristina, do you want to sort of discuss this concept of essential versus non-essential worker? And, what about situations where you have businesses that were considered non-essential, but someone has a work permit, for example, for that business?
Yeah, so the border officers, as you identified before, the border officers are really, once you've passed the airline official, the border officers are then going to say, well, why are you essential? Why do you have to come to Canada? So part of the packages we've been giving our clients is to explain to the border officers why this individual has to fulfill their duties while they're in Canada. So can this work be done remotely? Do they physically have to be in Canada? Is a job still there for them? So just because you have the work permit, as we know, there's a lot of layoffs that have been going on recently. So is your job still there? Are you laid off? Does your employer need you? So the officers are really, it's at the discretion of the border security officer to basically say, you know, are you needed in Canada is essentially what it is. So are you, you know, are you here to provide an economic service or something in the supply chain, or maybe in critical infrastructure or security? So it's really, the onus is on the worker to really get proof that this person is required to be in Canada. So we've been preparing these packages for our clients to prove that there's still a need for them to be in Canada.
Okay, and then Cristina, what about, okay, so you arrive in Canada, you're at the border, you satisfy this officer that you are going to an essential business, you are an essential worker. What about the quarantine aspect of it?
So quarantine is mandatory. Just before that, what you have to be mindful of, so they made an update to the Quarantine Act, or the Order in Council, in relation to the Quarantine Act, that anytime you're traveling to Canada, you have to have a mask or some sort of face covering. And that face covering has to be on from when you board the plane to essentially until you get to your place of quarantine. So quarantine, or they call it quarantine now, is mandatory. So you basically have to enter Canada and have your plan in place. So you have to know where you're going to be quarantining, for how long, if you have your essentials in order. So how are you getting from the airport to your place of quarantine? Are you taking public transportation? Is somebody picking you up? Are you taking a taxi? And then you have to have your food in order. So who will be delivering your food for 14 days? Your medication, what are those plans? Because essentially the border officers want to be satisfied that you're leaving the airport and going directly to self-quarantine for 14 days and not leaving until the 14-day period is up and you're not exhibiting any symptoms. Now,
yep, sorry, yep.
No, and then what is interesting is on the 14th, when they updated the Order in Council, the government also released that they have the power to actually send you to quarantine facilities. So for whatever reason, if you're not able to find a place, if you are allowed entry and you don't have a plan, or let's say you're taking public transportation, or you're really, you know, you don't have anything in place, if they are allowing you entry into Canada, they have the authority to send you to a self-quarantine facility. So that could be, we've heard that there's places like airport, hotels, or even military bases where they're keeping people in quarantine.
Okay. And I also understand now that the government has added, not only when individuals come into Canada now, where you have that customs form where you have to declare you know, how long you've been outside of Canada, are you bringing any goods into Canada, but now there is a coronavirus form, and in that form, each foreign national coming into Canada must, you know, provide the government with their address of where they are being quarantined, as you've discussed, their telephone number. So it's a way for the government to track individuals that are coming into Canada, and that's both at airports and land crossings as well.
Yeah.
So we talked a little bit about work permit holders. Can a person apply if they are coming from a country that you don't need a visa at the border to get a work permit, or is that prohibited? So for example, if I am a French national and I am coming into Canada and I'm applying under, for example, an intercompany transfer, or I've received an LMIA, am I permitted, as I have always been in the past, to pick up my work permit at the border?
The answer is no, because you have to pass the first gatekeeper, which is the airline. The airline wants to see an actual work permit. So if you're a French national coming in without that work permit in hand, then they're not able to apply for the work permit unless you have a package. So I've had both success, but technically the airlines aren't aware of that. So really the only ones that can do this are US nationals.
So if I'm in the United States and I'm not flying in, I then can apply at the border.
That's correct.
Okay. And then, you know, they've talked about exemptions for family members that are coming into Canada. So if I'm a family member of a Canadian citizen, a family member of a person that's on a work permit or even a study permit, and I want to come into Canada, what are some of the issues that you're seeing now with respect to family members uniting with those individuals that are already in Canada or perhaps even traveling with them?
So we do need special permission under the family reunification. Generally, we haven't been seeing any issues with people that are coming from anywhere outside of the US. So we'll use the example of the French national. They have to apply for special permission from the Canadian government. Once that's obtained, then they have the special permission. It's issued by the government of Canada saying that they fall within the exemption and they're able to travel to Canada. The issues we've really been seeing, believe it or not, are from people coming in from the United States. So the family members, even of Canadian citizens and permanent residents, that's the issue that we've been seeing. But foreign nationals from outside of Canada, we haven't been seeing any issues as long as they have that special permission. Sorry, Stephen, I'm not able to, I don't have your audio.
There, better. So I guess it's a special, so you have to apply for this special document where embassies, consulates to come in if you're abroad or not?
That's correct. Yes.
Okay. Okay. And as far as students go, nothing has really been updated with respect to that. The government of Canada is no longer issuing study permits at the moment. You can certainly apply. You must apply online, but then you have issues with respect to biometrics and medicals. I mean, do you want to discuss a little bit about biometrics and work permits and study permits for people that are currently applying and waiting?
Yeah, so right now, I mean, the IRCC system does allow you to apply for both the work permit and the study permit, but the issue is the application doesn't continue in the processing because the biometrics haven't been completed. Now, there's a few countries that do have biometric facilities open right now. So I think there's a few in China, in Vietnam, but there's very few of them. So what's happening now is these applications are now in queue to be processed, but can't continue to be processed because of the biometrics requirement. And the same goes if you require a medical, because these facilities and the access to doing the biometrics and the medicals is closed at the moment because of the pandemic.
Right. So in the past, you know, if an individual has a temporary work permit or a student visa, they've always had to satisfy a border officer that after they've completed the work or after they've completed their studies, they're going to return back home. What happens if I don't have a proper quarantine plan or I don't agree to be isolated? I mean, this is a new level that they've added on.
Yeah. So, I mean, the border, everything is at the discretion of the border officers, and they've essentially said, unless you're here and your studies are essential, so it's your classes are continuing, unless you have that quarantine plan, you cannot enter Canada. So we had recently someone arrive in Montreal where they didn't have a quarantine plan. They didn't think that the studies were necessary, and they got sent back onto a flight to Iran. So the officers are really they're taking a very hard stance on having to have the quarantine plan in place and to have an essential need to come to Canada. They're trying to restrict as much as they can for non-essential travel into the country.
You know, I guess it's interesting. Obviously, the amount of people that are coming into Canada has significantly declined, and now you have these border officers that really don't have much to do right now at the airport. So I guess there's a lot more questions, and they have a lot more time and ability to examine people more in depth. I mean, are you finding that?
Yeah, that's definitely it. There's a lot more questions. Before it was just a package. Okay, you have your work permit, your study permit, come on in. Now it's a lot. It's taking them a lot longer, and they have a lot of boxes to check. So they're definitely looking at those applications and asking a lot more questions than they did in the past.
Right. Okay, and I guess our sort of last comment people are always asking us, you know, is the government still working, processing? Yes, things are processing. You know, express entry is still ongoing. provincial nominee applications are still going, but again, they're meeting, lots of roadblocks where an applicant may need to provide a document, but they can't. A police certificate, they can't get that. Their, education certificates, they're not able to get that because the university may be closed down. So it's important to understand that, yes, the government is still processing. They are, from what we've seen, very obliging, and, a lot of discretion is being applied here now with respect to time limits. And, so we're finding, they're giving people lots of time. As far, let's say you can't complete your biometrics, it used to be 30 days. What's the government doing now, as an example?
90 days. So now they've extended the biometrics requirement automatically by 90 days. So it's in recognition of the fact that the biometric facilities just aren't operating at the moment. So they're extending that time.
Okay. Well, I guess now, pretty big topic, a very interesting tweet that went out last night from the President of the United States, and perhaps, Tim, you can discuss the tweet.
Of course. Well, I don't know if I can discuss the tweet. I can potentially interpret it because it's still, up for interpretation. But I think most definitely, and I think it's important to sort of highlight from these calls the last few weeks, and as Cristina and Stephen just identified and really presented, how delineated and how developed Canada's approach to this has been, developing these different standards that now we've arrived at, kind of a good listing to understand how and who can be let in. During this time, however, my contributions on these calls has been much more of a kind of loose interpretation by the individuals at the border, particularly Customs and Border Protection, not knowing in my conversations with them, not much guidance, not enough guidance to really make a determination on that essential, non-essential. And then we're sort of blindsided by last night's tweet, which said we are ending immigration into, from a prepositional standpoint, into the United States. And we're left to interpret that, which is, the most draconian sort of authority that the president can exercise. But I think from there, settling, obviously everybody sort of freaked out about that and the possibilities from that. But in reviewing what already was in place, reviewing what the feeling or sort of the stress, I think, from this administration was to keep the border open, desperation to sort of keep the ability to enter into the United States. And what we were ramping up to, I think, within the last week or so was the idea of maybe it is going to be a little bit easier to get into the United States. But then the re-signing between US and Canada on Friday about this agreement, I think maybe have sort of shook the cage and made the determination, hey, we've got to get more serious in line with Canada. But what does that boil down to? It boils down to a tweet on a Monday evening. So again, we're frustrated with that, but I think from there and identifying what is in place from the troika of operational bureaucracies within the United States for immigration. The first two that really have already been stressed or really are shuttered are the consular services. Those are not processing visas to actually allow everybody essentially other than Canadians to get to a consulate, allow them to enter into the United States. Those have been closed down. So that's not an avenue for a large majority of immigrants to pursue. And now potentially that physical border, I think, is potentially or most likely going to be restricted. So it's not going to be an essential, non-essential standard. That still is a possibility. But if it is, it's going to be cinched and sort of closed even further than it was. So those options at the physical border aren't going to be available. Consulates are shut. But then the ultimate sort of nucleus is within the United States, USCIS. So if you interpret the tweet, again, I'm not going to get into Article 2 interpretations of the Constitution, what his authority is, et cetera. But what is available right now, I think, is that he's going to allow, or the system will continue to operate within the United States, allowing for extensions to be filed for, to be adjudicated, for immigrant petitions to be filed. But basically what this allows the administration to do is kind of freeze it there. So if you want to take your immigrant visa married to a spouse, you're ultimately going to have to take that to a consulate. Or even if you get through the consulate, which really is probably going to be the last door to open in that of those three, getting to the physical border for an application for a work permit, that's going to be severely restricted. So as awful as it is to read that tweet and think what the ramifications are, I think it's really difficult to conclude anything that would involve USCIS sort of shutting down applications. And I think we've seen this before, you know, dramatic language being used and then sort of being walked back. I think, again, it was somewhat of a desperate move. The hope up until this time to make sure that, or to allow for, you know, commerce to continue across the US-Canadian border, that I think is now really up in the air, and we're going to have to wait for that guidance on what that's going to ultimately allow for ins and outs across the US-Canadian border. But it doesn't mean that the whole system's grinding to a halt. There's still this outlet for individuals within the United States. I don't think it's going to affect USCIS processing, but it will put everybody in sort of the same pool, which is I'm waiting for, you know, my ability to go to a consulate abroad. I'm waiting for my ability to come in and out of the United States as a potential visa holder already, or a individual who's coming in for that initial activation of that visa classification. So I think that's the big thing to take from it, is going to be essential, non-essential. That's going to be a moving needle, I think, at the physical border. But in reality, USCIS is going to continue to churn out applications. But again, I can't make that determination based off a tweet. But grammatically, which, you know, we know that the White House isn't great with grammar, but thinking about into the United States, I think there was a clear definition of that. You know, if you have status, you're going to be, and you're outside the United States, it's maybe difficult to be getting back to the United States. But if you're in on the ground with permanent residence, with a temporary visa being processed for an extension, that should be okay. And then, you know, the physical border is going to be something that's really going to be sort of nebulous upcoming, and maybe still ascribing to that essential, non-essential. But we'll have to wait for the next tweet to determine that. So
you know, it's interesting.
That's where you can sort of leave it. Sorry, Steve.
No, it's interesting too that Air Canada just announced that they're stopping all flights between Canada and the US coming this weekend. So again, it's becoming more restricted even with the airlines.
Yeah, I mean, and those are sort of preliminary steps I'm sure they're taking in order, you know, based on this. But also, you know, the internal dialogue or internal communication between Canada and US, what was it that they came to a conclusion on? And again, I think this webinar is a firm example of all of the things that Cristina and Steve were talking about, what Canada has been doing for the last 2 to 3 weeks. I think US and part of this administration has been champing at the bit to say, well, we just want to have everything ready to go when we're ready to debut. Now, and again, I don't want to get into political, but you know, that the aspect of now taking this into some sort of, you know, an employment initiative to rehire Americans, all that type of stuff, that could be some of the sort of political feedback that's coming out in this America for Americans again, and sort of, you know, making immigration be a negative. But that's the gloomy prognosis from last night's tweet. There have been, you know, prior to the tweet, we were hopeful, as I said, that maybe the non-essential, essential definition was moving to the benefit of allowing people to go back to the border. That really has been shuttered. But now some of the good news is employment authorization cards. Those are related to open work permits for students, for dependent spouses, for individuals who are in the process of a green card. We have just this past week seen a significant movement on those. And those have been delayed for months on end outside of normal processing times for well over a year plus. Those now, we just saw a deluge this week of applications that have been pending for less than the standard 90 days coming through. So that's anecdotal, but it is in relationship to an initiative where, because all the local field offices, where relevant to Cristina and Stephen's discussion, biometrics have done, they said they're waiving that for extensions. And that, I think, has been the trigger that's allowed these EADs to just sort of flow through. Another issue that came through this week, which I think is important to talk about, and we talked about it on last week's webinar, was claims for unemployment insurance within the United States. That was clarified federally for any unemployment insurance that would be coming from a federal standpoint, was not to be something to be considered a public charge, and also, you know, essentially is something that you pay into. The complication that's really been sort of discovered this week is state regulation, and state regulations that could really be complicated for individuals who are on the ground under a temporary visa, because the standards for that temporary visa for, you know, an H-1B and L, even though you have sort of 60-day window to wind down affairs, et cetera, there's standards still internal to that is once you're out of work, you got to get out. And from that, and then applying certain standards from states, is this requirement under state unemployment insurance is if you're able-bodied, if you can get out there and find a job, then you're not allowed to collect that unemployment insurance yet. And obviously with an H-1B, an L, whatever it would be, your classification is tied to an employer. So that's definitely a complication that, you know, we've had questions about unemployment insurance, about the public charge, whether that's going to be sort of a damning cause to us. That I don't think is applicable, but this idea of non-immigrants who do want to collect unemployment insurance really has become a hot button issue. So we've got some questions. I mean, I think that's a good transition. I'm sort of complete on mine, and there are some questions that are coming through. After Trump's tweet, are OPT applications made earlier still processed? Yeah, I think that really goes to the idea of that's internal. That's already been placed. That's been submitted internally through USCIS. So again, I think it really has to be, and again, not focusing on prepositions, but into the United States. If you're on the ground, if that OPT application has already gone in, you know, twofold. It looks like the EAD, employment authorization, OPT work authorization cards are coming a little faster. And internally within the United States, I don't see, you know, there being a pause on USCIS processing, but we still have to wait to see whether that shakes out. But likely, I think it should. There are some other ones that are coming through. Stephen and Christina, are you able to see those?
Yeah. So one of the questions we have is, have there been any changes to the timetables regarding citizenship applications for those of us who have already applied?
Well, citizenship is totally on hold if there is a test involved or the oath. Otherwise, everything else is proceeding along. But there is no finalization, one would say, of one's citizenship now because there are no oath ceremonies.
Yep. Is the entry-exit program scheduled for June 2020 for airports still scheduled to start as planned in light of the pandemic? I would say probably not. What would you think, Stephen?
Yeah, I'm not sure because of what they're dealing with now, and you know, it doesn't even there really isn't much of a rush because no one's traveling. So you know, we'll have to see, but I have no idea with respect to that.
Another question about processing. Are the federal applications under the Quebec Investor Scheme being processed?
Yes, everything's being processed, provided you don't need to see someone in person, provided, you know, that all the documents are there. So yes, it's proceeding.
Yeah. So exactly what Stephen said, as long as you have the documents, where we're not seeing it being processed is like we said before, if you don't have biometrics or if you have to complete your biometrics, but things are getting processed. They might be a little bit slower, but things are getting processed if not related to having to complete something in person. And the last question we have is, if lucky enough to be granted a work permit at the port of entry, can someone start working without a SIN number?
Well, I mean, you need a SIN number to start working, and you can get a temporary one quite quickly. But remember, when you come in, you can't work for the first 14 days. So you've got lots of time to deal with that, and you can apply for your SIN number online now. You don't have to go in person. So, yeah. So I, just like to thank everyone. I hope we were able to answer some of your questions and give you some updated information. And we're done, I believe.
Yep, we're done. So I just wanted to thank everyone for attending today. I hope you all found it very informative. I'd also like to thank Stephen, Tim, and Cristina for taking the time to share their expert advice. We really appreciate it. To everyone in attendance, make sure to sign up to our alerts from the link provided to stay up to date with the latest immigration news. And until next time, everybody, stay safe.
Thanks. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you.